Hi, it's Steve Hargadon and Reed Hepler, and we're here for This Week in AI. It is Friday, July 26, 2024. Good morning, Reed.
Morning. We've had a crazy week in AI stuff, a lot of it with education, but also a lot of it with, um, uh, with just with technology things in general. We have a lot of different things that are happening, and so it'll be interesting to see how AI intersects with those.
We
Um,
talked last week about the fragility of technology, especially electronic technology, and then you personally experienced it in not being able to get on a flight.
yes, exactly. Yeah. So, in fact, that's the second thing I'm going to talk about a little bit because I think it is interesting. Um, but the first thing was on Monday, Ethan Mollick released a blog post called "Confronting Impossible Futures," which I was reading and I thought I'm going to send this to Steve, and then you sent it to me also. So let's just talk a little bit about what that said and what implications it has for businesses and such.
Yeah, you get started and I'll jump in.
Okay. So one of the things that I thought was really interesting was that he notes, first of all, he notes that people are not really preparing for things that experts are saying are going to happen. A lot of people are talking about, the singularity, or like we've been talking about, smaller singularities or whatever we're going to say. And a lot of people are acting as though it's going to happen, but businesses and organizations are not really preparing for that. And one of the things he does mention kind of the large scale, like we need to prepare for one of four futures that the singularity can bring to pass. But one of the things he was talking about was that businesses need to have practical trainings and practical solutions of using AI for regular tasks and not like overhauling everything. And so I think that really speaks to what we're doing with the boot camp and with our general products, that we are just trying to help people, you know, use AI where they're at and not necessarily, um, you know, where they think they should be.
Yeah,
So
there's
I
so
thought it
many
was really
promises.
powerful.
There's a um, there's this over-promising problem that you and I have talked about, and I feel like I'm not sure you addressed that directly, but I certainly have noticed that when I get these, like yeah, I'll even ask ChatGPT or one of the large language models, what are the 10 most productive ways to use a large language model? And it
Uh-huh.
will give me a response, and it's filled with promises. It will help schedule your meetings, and you can delegate tasks. And I'll say, okay, please give me the 10 most pragmatic and practical ways I can currently use large language models. And it still will give me some vague promises. So somehow inherent in all of this is this idea that you're going to wave a magic wand and AI is going to accomplish it for you. And I haven't had AI manage my calendar or be able to do these things. And if I want to, it's typically because there's a commercial program that I would have to pay for
Uh,
that would have to hook up to my Google Calendar and has the ability to delete a calendar. Well, I'm not going to
yeah.
give it that permission. So but I think the scenario planning is interesting because that comes, I think, originally from the Shell oil material on scenario planning has become, and I think Ethan even teaches a class where he uses scenario planning or talks about it
Yes.
in
Uh-huh.
his schoolwork. And so that's hard for an individual to do,
That's true.
right?
Yeah.
It's more like for a business. But I think, what you and I are drilling down on in the boot camp is find one thing that actually really works for you that is productive and do that one bite at a time. don't
Uh-huh.
don't buy into all the magic promises. Don't think somehow you're going to wave a magic wand, it's going to solve all these problems. For it can solve specific problems or issues or help you do certain specific things in ways that are brilliant and life changing, but it's not a
Uh,
magic wand.
yeah. Well, and it's interesting. I think, and this is just me, there are two types of overpromising when it comes to AI or any tech. First, there's just plain old overpromising, where they're like, we can cause all your financial stuff to go away, and it doesn't do that because no one can do that. Secondly, is promising something and it can happen, but only with, like you're saying, giving away privacy or paying money or stuff like that, where they say, oh, there's all these capabilities, but you have to go through these shady terms or pay money. I mean, you were talking about having a device or having a service that would connect to your calendar. And a lot of people, me included in the past, when I was in high school especially, boom, I would do it in a heartbeat without even thinking about it. But you have to think about these things. So it's interesting that um, They were promised, and then also some, I guess there's the third type where they are trying to do that and they technically have the capability, but they're not really doing it and it's not really effective. And this kind of goes into my news, personal news. We alluded to this earlier, but I was foiled by a tech error this weekend. I was going to go to Orlando and I was going on a flight. So I flew into Salt Lake City Airport and it was like a hour long flight. And then I was waiting for my next flight that was supposed to leave, at like 9:30, and then it delayed until 10, and then 10:30, and then we got on, and then we waited on the plane for 3 hours. And then they finally said, okay, we're letting everybody off because the back of the plane is getting too hot. It's not safe. And they kept giving us, excuses after excuses. It's the wind was one of their big ones. I'm like, you have to wait for the wind to change. I'm like, that is ridiculous. Anyway, and then they um they told us it was canceled. But they said you have to you probably want to reschedule things. And so I waited in line for another, like probably 4 or 5 hours, only to hear at the end of the line, oh, it's still scheduled. It's been reinstated, and you have half an hour to get into the line. It's gonna leave. And so I didn't. Nobody told me this. So then I had to run from the front of the line to the airplane, get my dinner in line, and then I was gonna get online. Then they canceled it after that. So I spent 10 hours in the airport when I didn't have to, and that was all because of CrowdStrike's update, where they updated the computer and then it had issues and stuff. And anyway, all of those is just the solution is to have a human go and find the bad files, delete them, and then reboot the computer to and hope that it doesn't happen again. And so it's stuck in a booting loop. And this is not an AI thing, but it is kind of indicative of technology's fallibility. That if we rely too much on technology, a simple error of some kind can cause, cascading implications. So I mean, I had to cancel my presentations. It not only affected my flight, it affected other teachers' flights. I wasn't able to present. A lot of people were messaged me and had to go and look at recordings later on. So it just all these implications. And so AI people, especially where they are doing beta testing, but not maybe as strategically or as completely as they should be. I think that they have a responsibility to have better fixes. So that was really interesting. So that was my news. Uh,
Let's pause there for a second,
yes.
because it kind of goes back to the Ethan Mollick article. There's this rush to profitability, right? So we know technology is tricky. You can become dependent on it quickly. We know that there can be unintended consequences.
Uh-huh.
Even, how long has Windows been out, right? And so
Yeah.
we have this massive outage because of the CrowdStrike update. But so there's a lot of right now what's happening in AI is there's an enormous amount of rush to promising because of potential profitability. People are trying to get the mind share or the market share, trying to get it in advance, to get their project or program bought by a larger company. And so one of the things when I was looking at the Ethan Mollick articles, I looked up these services that do these promises to integrate and solve the magic wand kind of solutions.
Uh-huh.
And a very good article said, well, they're targeting people who have discretionary income, so they're trying to get moms to sign up who can then want to delegate their uh, the task that they need to do to paid commercial laborers, and so they're trying to make a connection between the mom and the person who cleans the house or the person who takes care of the kids, and that it's just an enormous kind of set of uh, attempts to get you to pay for something else, but not really actually that productive. And no mom is going to spend 10 hours to try and figure out how to delegate to save 3 hours of time. So there's this sort of rush to make promises, and there's a rush to develop, right? And so we saw this with Microsoft and their search summaries. We saw it with a lot of the sort of the big visible mistakes that have happened feel to me like they're because it's not a careful, thoughtful move forward. It's a rush to try and get in there and be the one to make a profit. Can we
Uh-huh.
say one other quick thing about Ethan Mollick's article? I
Yes.
was
Yeah.
interested that he seemed to confirm what you and I have said,
Uh-huh.
which is that the custom GPT right now feels like it's one of the big silver bullets. Like what custom GPTs can do for you is really tremendous. And so you don't have to play around with a lot of the other vague promises. there are a lot of things you can do with a custom GPT that are just great for individuals and for businesses.
Uh-huh. Well, and there are, yes, there are. And but again, you have to think through these things deliberately because you have to think like, what am I using it for? And so that's where we come in, I think, and help people find that. But there are many, many things that that you can do. You just have to remember to keep kind of the human in control of it, or remember that the human is responsible. And I think there's a danger of people forgetting that. And in other news, this past week I was introduced to and joined the human intelligence movement, which is really it's called Human Intelligence for Artificial Intelligence movement, and it's basically it's trying to prepare students for AI in the workplace or for an AI-driven world, and emphasizes the human qualities, the human abilities like creative thinking, design thinking, collaboration, communication, talking about how we need to basically make sure that human feelings and human voices are in AI, um, in AI outputs. So it's kind of like the education version of kind of what we're doing and making sure that people are career ready and ready for using AI. So that's really interesting. There's also these types of materials being created with that.
Did you get a
In actual,
T-shirt or did you get some kind of swag to indicate you're part of the movement? Did they send
so
you
I don't have any swag, no, but I do have access to a folder that has PowerPoints. They
but I
have
am a human.
yes, exactly. They have a manifesto. They have a PowerPoint presentation. They have I'm actually reading off of a little talking points and things, and it's just interesting to see that a lot of people are trying to create like communities of practice and groups to make sure that I really think that the point of groups is to make sure that you are not the only one, kind of with our future of AI thing. It's a little bit different, but we're trying to make sure that we're not the only ones doing this and that we're all trying to help each other through this and help each other make sure we're doing good things, and following best
Yeah.
practices and things.
And
So really,
you've talked a lot about ultimately you are responsible, right? So there's
uh,
going to be this help from a large language model that's language, not logic. Ultimately, you have to be responsible for making decisions for the creative, but the tool is incredible
uh,
as long as you're responsible. So it feels like that kind of goes along with what you've just described.
yes, yes. And it's interesting to see how different people are interpreting it. If you look on LinkedIn or look on Facebook, all sorts of people have different ideas of what does it mean for a human to be responsible. So now back in more news, um, and this is yesterday, but a lot of people are hearing about it today, and we talked about this before we started. Um, OpenAI announces Search GPT, an AI-powered search engine. So we talked about how ChatGPT is not a search engine, but now it's apparently going to become one. And so it's specifically made to rival Perplexity and Google. So ChatGPT has always been an LLM first and foremost, but Perplexity went and they combined that LLM with a search engine, which I think is really interesting. And so now SearchGPT is taking ChatGPT a step further and becoming actually you don't even have to connect with Bing, just use ChatGPT for it. So we'll see how that goes. What are your thoughts? I know you like Perplexity for a lot of things.
Perplexity has really fascinated me in the last couple of weeks, in part because they added the voice component, which I really like. And I like the voice component better in Perplexity because you hold to tap and speak, and then you let go. Whereas
Uh-huh.
when I talk to ChatGPT through the voice mode, it often thinks I'm done before I'm done and starts to answer the question before I've actually fully formulated the question. I also like that Perplexity shows me that it's searching different sites while it's trying to formulate its answer. So it's not just using trained data, it's going out and looking for information. And then we've talked about this sort of death of expertise problem, right? So it tells you where it got the information. So when I've wanted more, I click on the footnote and it
Yes.
takes me to the site that had the information. So in
Uh-huh.
a lot of ways, Perplexity, and again, this has happened so fast. We were just having these conversations about the death of
Uh-huh.
expertise and about search.
Uh-huh.
So I don't know for sure. This is very new news to you, and even newer to me. But I would have to guess that OpenAI is feeling a little bit of the pressure because they're really not a search engine. The large language model is not a search model. It's just not good for search. It's not based on truth. And
No, it's
so,
not.
and or factual findings. It's based on the language model. So I would have to imagine they're feeling a little bit of pressure. You told me to go to the site. I went to the site and I'm signing up for a waiting list, which means the product isn't even ready. So they've announced before it's ready, which to me sort of screams of we're trying to make sure that you don't forget that we can do it, everything everybody else is doing. We just haven't done it yet.
Yeah, yeah. Well, and so that is interesting, the dynamics of that, because now people are expecting this amazing thing right out the bat when they release it. So it's going to be interesting to see what happens there. And who thought of that? I wonder if that's Sam Altman's idea or if that's somebody else's idea.
Who knows?
Um, yeah, who knows? But really interesting. Yeah, it kind of talks a little bit, and this is interesting because last week they had a presentation, or at least a discussion on their progression. If you recall, last week we talked about that Sam Altman did a presentation and talked about that they're progressing to AGI, and like the third or fourth step
Mhm.
is search engine AI things that can be agents. Well, this is another big step in that area. So really,
We don't have to open up the whole can of worms right now,
you know,
but there's number one, there's this issue with uh, large language models doing search because they're not designed for reasoning or logic. They're designed for taking accumulated trained data and producing word frequency responses. But the second is that the like we talked about with China sending representatives to the large language model developers and people using it to make sure that it conforms to the legal standards for what information can be put on the web.
yeah.
And the shaping of this is an enormous area for power and control. The shaping of the responses is going to be really interesting. Part of what I like about Perplexity is I don't feel like I'm getting a shaped response, but sometimes I'll ask ChatGPT or Claude a question, and it will say, I'm not comfortable answering that question. So somehow there's human shaping of the responses and what's politically correct or okay to talk about. So I'm reluctant to see large language models move forward in this area without a really good discussion about, hey, how much is this data being shaped? How much are we representing that it's trained on the Overton window of whatever it is? And are we being truthful about the fact that it's not always going to tell the truth?
Uh,
We've talked about that before.
well, it's interesting to see that, or to think that because AI tools talk like human, like they talk in full sentences, these generative AI tools, people are more likely to believe them because of that programmed report, because of everything. We talked about this for months, all these different factors, and it's just becoming more and more easy to believe them because people believe search engines, even, you know, and so, and even those AI overviews. And so it's going to be even more tempting to believe it because now you're combining the conversation ability of ChatGPT with a search engine. Um, and other, all sorts of other, I mean, Perplexity. I like that Perplexity has its sources, and so you can tell that it's like it's not just citing itself. Like you're not trusting Perplexity, you're trusting Perplexity's summary of the sources. You can click on the sources. A lot of times, ChatGPT can't even check the sources, but there's it's good a trend I think in people believing AI. There's
Yeah.
also a trend away I think also from using it productively. People don't really want to use it productively, but they like the answers they get from it. So it's interesting that they're not wanting to use it the way it was meant to be used, but they do want to use it in ways it wasn't meant to be used. So,
Let's pause there for another second. We've talked about, so you said trust, right? So if I see footnotes and I see what feels like very sort of librarian kind of responses that are sourced and look like they're encyclopedic or accurate, that's one way that I trust. The other is that we have cognitive shortcuts for trust. And that's the concern of all these science fiction movies, right? So an alluring, sexy female voice telling you something, we may have cognitive shortcuts for trust and decision making that I don't want the AI to be implementing. Right? I don't want to build a relationship with Scarlett Johansson's voice so that I'm more likely to trust the information. I want Perplexity to give me a very plain voice with footnotes.
uh, yeah, well, and it's just to put you in the right mindset. Yeah, to make sure that it's not, there's just all sorts of issues I think that's going to happen. And that brings me to my other, it's not really news, it's my news. I made a blog post about skepticism and AI stuff and having the right mindset. And it's all about Carl Sagan because I was like, what would I had a question. What would Carl Sagan think about generative AI stuff? Did you ever watch Cosmos or read Cosmos or anything like that? Any
I
of his
didn't.
stuff?
No.
No. He's really interesting. He's one of the world's greatest science communicators. And I really like that term to describe him, science communicators. And so it was like, what would Carl Sagan think about this? And I kind of talked about his theories of skepticism. Like, I'm not going to say that everything's wrong, but I'm going to test everything out and think critically about it. So that was really interesting, and that speaks to people, believing AI stuff
Read.
without really checking it.
So one of the things you and I've talked about is that you can build a custom GPT with the written material from someone that you like. So it's kind of
Yes.
like a talking to a genius thing, right? So
Uh-huh.
you can say, so you could upload all of Carl Sagan's written material and transcripts, and then you could essentially ask the large language model to act as Carl Sagan and to use his voice. And I actually think it's sort of fascinating. It
Uh-huh.
would be fun to actually try that with Carl
Yes.
Sagan's material and then say, okay, now I want to have a conversation with Carl Sagan about some of these trickier issues and see if the large language model is capable of actually producing some insight that you and I would say, wow, okay, that was actually helpful. Or some group of scientists that we like. Like I
Uh-huh.
think I told you, I did this with all of Ivan Illich's material,
Uh-huh.
the man who wrote Deschooling Society, amongst another other books. When in the history of mankind have we actually had the opportunity to converse with a deceased genius? I know it's
Yes.
nuance there. It's not actually a conversation with Ivan Illich,
Uh-huh.
but large language models are very good at picking up style and thinking processes.
Hmm. Hmm. Well, yeah. On that note, another news article I was going to bring up: AI chatting with dead relatives. It seems every
Yeah.
single week there's a new thing about AI and dead people. But I mean, dead relatives, dead geniuses, dead enemies, anybody really. You have enough material right now. It's mostly text, but you could probably do video if you have like a Hume AI thing. You could upload the
Yeah.
videos and stuff, and use the semantic analysis and things, and talk with your dead relative on AI. Totally Black Mirror. I totally hate it, but you can do it. So
I think there's going to be a very interesting positive twist here because the video is going to be good too, right? You're going to be able,
uh,
it's going to be able, it's going to do what we've thought science fiction was telling us we could do for forever. It's going to produce a holographic image of the person and it's going to look very realistic and they're going to talk.
yeah,
So what if I have unresolved issues with my dad and I've uploaded all this material? My dad was prolific in ways that would help a large language model. So lots of writing, speaking recordings. I recorded him for hours talking about his childhood. I could have a conversation with my dad. Number one is, will I develop a closer relationship with the AI version of my dad than I had in real life? But the other is, will I use it for therapeutic purposes? Will I say, hey, this has always bothered me, Dad, X, Y, and Z.
uh,
And will we consider that a therapeutic way of resolving issues with people who impacted us in our lives?
yeah, that is interesting, and you will never know. I mean, I guess we will know. We could know, but and you could like say like I want a positive end to this conversation. I want a
Yeah.
negative end to this conversation, right? And so you can control the mind of your,
Mhm.
just
I'm
all
going
this
to make
stuff.
him much friendlier.
Exactly, right? Yeah, friendliness, 100. Yeah, who knows what you could do? Um, it's just interesting. Um, yeah, I'm having trouble thinking of this. I'm gonna move past this because it's causing my brain to explode. Do you have any other comments about this?
No, no,
Uh,
I do think it's an area that's fraught with issues related to scamming.
yes,
And like I got a PayPal email this week that I still don't know if it was legitimate or not. But the ability to draw information together to make it look like something, and then if there's a voice and there's even a video image. Okay, if Ethan Mollick is right, this is the worst AI that we're ever going to use. It's
yes,
not hard to imagine that within a year or two, we won't know if the person we're talking to is actually the person we're talking to. That
yes,
you could be sitting here and you could actually be speaking, and your avatar is representing you speaking, and it's actually correcting grammatical errors, or it's adjusting for long pauses. This feels inevitable,
Yeah.
right? And then what are you going to do when that electronic image asks you for a piece of information that could be critical to their then cracking your financial history or some other way of scamming you? So will we go back to saying I'm not going to make any decisions until I meet you in person?
Yeah.
It's not.
Right. Exactly. Yeah. Who knows? That'll be interesting. We could. It seems very Asimov-ian or very um, kind of like a Bradbury novel. I'm thinking of all the science fiction stuff. Yeah. You never know, but that could do to. I mean, working relationships, personal. I mean, you could have a date with, if your significant other
Yeah.
is in, I don't know, Asia somewhere and you're in Europe, you could have dates with each other's holograms and act like it's in person. And yeah, who knows what could happen. It's really interesting.
So
Um,
can I tell you one quick thing? I
yes.
bought an AI training this week. It was like
Okay.
50 sessions on AI, just to see kind of what people are doing, what they're talking about. And one of the sessions was narrated by a visual avatar that moved when it spoke, and it looked very much like the woman who was giving the presentation, but it was an avatar version of her. But it was very close to her. So
Okay.
this is actually so close to reality. The other piece of
Huh.
that that's interesting is I took all of those recorded sessions. It was about 15 hours of recordings on AI, and I sent them to Otter. And then
Huh.
Otter summarized each one and gave me the main points so I could look through and decide which trainings I actually wanted to pay more attention to. That's a silver bullet for me, right? So
Uh-huh.
to take massive
Yeah.
amounts of training material and then put it in a form where I can kind of figure out what I actually want to drill down on.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, and yeah, massive productivity saver. And speaking of that a little bit, and this is well, not really our last one, but our second to last one. I'm going to combine two of them. First of all, studies have said, well, one study said that AI promotes creativity, and then or really that it flattens creativity. So it makes less creative people more creative, but it doesn't really help the creative people that much. I think it helped. Maybe I'm not creative because I thought it helped me a lot. And then, but also another study said that it lessens productivity, that a lot of people are saying, I have to go back and do work again because I have to double check AI's work. And I think a lot of that, and I talked about this on LinkedIn, a lot of that is due to inaccurate training on how to use AI tools. Because if you don't know how to use it effectively, then you're going to use it awfully. I mean, that's just what's going to happen.
Mhm.
And so to that, to address those, maybe not to address those specific things, but at least to address related questions, researchers have developed a framework to merge AI and human intelligence for process safety. So what that means, in my mind at least, I think, is that basically not going to disrupt the existing process, but it's going to be more um, it's just going to enhance the existing one and make it more effective. So really interesting there that AI is lessening productivity, but researchers are trying to merge AI and human intelligence to make people more productive. And they're thinking that it's going to be more productive. So I think it is, a lot of it is using it the right way versus using it the wrong way is what's happening. But
So I'll comment on that. I feel like we're not entirely honest about how we work, right? So we sort of pretend that we're more logical and robotic than we actually are.
yes.
And one of my favorite sayings is the Irish saying, "How will I know what I'm thinking until I hear myself say it?"
Uh-huh.
There's a part of thinking where you think out loud and you process and you think in communication with other people. And there's a large degree to which our creativity and um, idea generating and follow through are related, can be related to how much we're communicating with other people and the energy that that gives us. So there is a way in which AI really helps with that, right? So it's not just there's this blank page thing that goes on where the AI can generate a first draft for you, but also I think out loud with AI all the time in a way that I would with a person, right?
Uh-huh.
I'm interested in a topic. I was interested in, a particular country in the Middle East, and so I started to have a conversation. And it would be hard for me to focus my attention in the same way as it was to actually start through conversation with the AI, because then I could ask questions and I could follow specific threads. This goes to Mortimer Adler's book, How to Read a Book, which was you don't start at the first page and just read straight through, talking about nonfiction. You treat a book like a conversation. Look at the index, look at the table of contents, look for the chapters, trying to figure out what the overall flow of the book is. He was trying to get you into a way of thinking of the book, having a conversation with the book, the way you'd have a conversation with the expert himself. You wouldn't start at page one. You'd ask the first question that you cared about. So I do think we need to kind of understand how we work in order to work well with AI. And so if we're not really thinking about how we work, then we're going to do all of these things kind of pretending that, again, we wave the magic wand or it's going to do this for me. But it can be really, really helpful in engaging you into conversation and getting you thinking, but it needs to be your thinking. That's my personal opinion.
Yeah,
It needs to
yeah.
be my thinking, not the AI's thinking.
Well, and on that note, that leads us to our last article of I don't know, and at least a practitioner in the photo industry said that Midjourney 6, which is the latest Midjourney model, says that it's going to significantly affect the photo industry. It's going to, make really, really impressive images. One of the quotes says, with Midjourney 6, it's not possible to rely entirely on AI images for my websites. I don't think that exactly is true. I mean, I think that photographers are still going to be valued, and part of that is because I have members of my family who are photographers, so I feel that a vested interest in their success. But I think that, again, it's all how you use it.
Yeah.
And so if you're going to be a highly successful and you're a highly productive photographer and know what you're doing, you can use Midjourney to enhance your photographs, and you can have an AI enhanced physical photograph and it'll look really good.
Yeah.
I just don't know that native AI images are going to be that perfect, but who knows?
I think native AI images are going to replace stock photography. They're
Okay.
not going to replace the wedding photographer.
Yeah.
You
Okay.
don't want AI to generate your wedding photos,
No.
but
No.
it does make sense that if you're looking for stock photography for an article, that the AI is going to replace it. Photography ends up being this really interesting thread through a lot of transitions in the last 50 years, right? Because I was a zone system photographer. Some in the audience are going to know what that means, but Ansel Adams zone system, and for exposures and for black and white photos, and then for color photos, I used the gray card, and so I knew exposure. And then the phone turned into a very, very good camera. First, cameras got really good, and anybody could take a picture equivalent to the quality of the pictures I was taking with all of the work that I'd done to figure out exposure. Then the camera goes into the phone, and even less so is my expertise in photo exposure and composition making a difference. And it's like, okay, I just kind of gave up, right? Anybody can take a photo as good as the ones I was working on. I enjoyed what I did at the time that I did it, but I recognized that photography was showing a shift. And now, isn't it interesting? Another shift taking place where photography is at the center. It's it will not probably, in my mind, change the family and wedding photographer business, but I do think it's going to change the stock photo business.
That's really interesting. We have a lot of different specific conversations that we can pull out of this one. This is going to be really interesting to have some ideas to go off of. Really, really, really cool. I think that's all for the news. And we've done about a half an hour, so I think that's all for this week. But next week we can talk about where it probably will be many more AI over promises or any other topics. I don't know. I can't wait to see what's going to happen next week. So
we're actually skipping a week because
that's
you're going to be
true.
away.
We have 2 weeks of content. Yeah.
So are we purposefully going to ignore the deep dives for the sake of time, and we'll just pick them up?
I would think ignore the deep dives right now for the sake of time, and see if there's other things that are going to happen in the future. But
Awesome.
yeah,
Thank you, Reed.
yeah, thank you very much.